This is an experiment. Thanks for indulging us. This is where you see the military side of John Mogge a little bit and kind of what's behind that part. A lot of what I'm going to share is what I learned about war and politics at the Air War College as a colonel. So let's go to the next slide, please. To do this, we've got a panel. Ken, can you unmute yourself and say hello to everybody?
Good morning. Can you hear me?
We can. Closer to the mic.
Okay. Can you hear me better?
Yes. Excellent. Loud and clear. So Ken is going to handle the economics piece of this. He's one of our associated experts with the group. Attorney, great history. I think many of you know Ken from past forums with Kimberly Clark, and of course Bruce and Mark are going to be joining into this. So you got the AHC team here with our thoughts around this topic of ESG and the Ukrainian war. The other part that I would just introduce here, the rest of the panel, is you. We do want participation. The idea here, nobody knows what this really looks like or means. But I think the collective crowdsourced knowledge that we can do as a group might create some value and some learnings and some understandings for companies and how to deal with these issues. So the idea is just to kind of uncover some of this and then have some group participation and some sort of simulation, a simulation of the thinking here. Go to the next one if you would. Oh. So to lead us off, this is Air Force Doctrine. It's a struggle, right? Certainly see that going on. But there's a whole lot more behind this activity that you don't hear too much about in the press. And it's not that it's hugely classified, it's just it's not interesting, right? But takeaway here that I'd just like to highlight to start connecting the dots to the ESG topic is the bottom line there. You know, traditionally in our country, we look at 4 instruments of national power. Diplomacy, that failed, right? Informational war, that's still in play. How much of you believe what you see on the networks? Good. It's a bona fide question. Show of hands. Do you believe what you see on the networks? Do you think you're seeing all of it? Yeah, maybe 50%, right? So there's informational war going on both ways right now. Military, we know what that shooting part's about. And, you know, in a war of attrition at 300 soldiers a day, you can do the math. Ukraine's got maybe 90 more days. And then last is economic. And that's really where we want to focus, is the economic aspects of this and what the corporations of the world have done in their exit from Russia. And that list grows. I don't know, probably many of you have seen the Yale professor who's tracking all of the logos coming out of Russia, whether it be a full stop like BP, Ken's going to talk about that a little bit, or just a cease of operations or rebranding, but it's pretty significant. Big question here is it having a difference, right? Is it making a difference? What we haven't seen, and we've asked Ken to dig into this, is any of the oil and gas majors besides BP really take a stance. All right. So let's go to the next one, please.
John, you have the slide clicker there too.
Yeah. So I don't want to go into this too far, but I wanted to point out that this is the traditional version. Sorry. This is a traditional version of how the military thinks about combat, and it's built around a philosophy that starts with you're going to try not to fight. You're going to do everything you can not to have, you know, a combat activity. Exhaust all other means, economic, political, informational, anything you can do to avoid putting our men and women in harm's way in a shooting match. That's the American philosophy. That's our political approach to things. War is the last resort. So where are we? If you think about it from the standpoint of that spectrum, we're kind of where the question mark is. And the big big thing that's out there is where in this spectrum between general and limited warfare, conventional warfare, are we really, knowing that Russians do have chemical and biological and nuclear weapons? Next slide, please. So that's the first big lead-off question we wanted to start with, and this is where we get audience participation, hopefully. So we want your thoughts here. You know, if the economic measures, one of four, going back to DIME, are really what's leading the Western corporations to take the actions they are taking, is that some sort of distributed national power? Maybe unintentionally. Why would any of those companies do this beyond what we understand as investment interest?
You want feedback now?
Yes.
Yeah. So
Mike.
I think we should first consider that the 1,000 firms that Yale tracks try to punish Putin, it is global capitalism's response, not American national interest. So that's the first, but we would like people to respond to that. So can you answer that question, Chris Morrow?
Well, it seems like it was social pressure as much as any economic interest. You know, the zeitgeists right after the war seemed to drive corporations out based on their customers and the political and social climate at the time. I don't think it was an economic calculus so much.
Well said. Anybody want to build on that? Thank you, Heather.
I guess I would say that I think it's economics in the sense that companies feel they need to do this, or likely feel they need to do this in order to keep their customer base happy. I mean, I think there was a bit of a demand, and I'll just admit, I don't really know much about that tracking that you identified, but earlier this week, I happened to be at a different meeting that was focused on enterprise risk, and the same topic was discussed there. And there were some even folks who were unhappy with that list as it's been developed, because they felt some firms were shown in a bad light who haven't pulled out entirely. But if their market is around food sourcing or things where there might be humanitarian concerns that they might be putting above pulling out entirely, they felt it was sort of an unfair influence. So that's why I think it's really about social influence and the economics of maintaining customers. And for some companies, it puts them in a very difficult position. It may not be as easy as people might think it is for them to turn on and off their activities in country.
So I'd be interested in carrying the conversation further, right, John? So
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, if you think of traditional, yeah, we'll go with.
Good morning, everybody. We don't have any operations in Ukraine. However, we work very closely with a lot of other companies who do, such as Accenture, Microsoft, et cetera. And the work they have done to help their Russian employees find work in other countries and to give them stipends to hold over until they can find other employment has really been exemplary. So I don't think that those stories are shared enough of you're pulling out and leaving Russian citizens high and dry without a job. I don't really think that's accurate either.
Well said. I mean, I think so just to begin giving some concepts that might be relevant to Ukraine plus the future of your companies. If you study theories of capitalism, they're all dated. Everybody at Harvard or INSEAD or Australia, like David Oliver in Australia, capitalism is already morphed so that it responds to social pressure. So all the thinking from Milton Friedman and the Chicago Finance School to the present people who publish in academic circles don't know yet what the corporations are actually doing, right? The corporations are responding to social stresses like war, before the theory of capitalism is defined. So I think that's part of what John is struggling, why he decided that this is an issue. I mean, and I think Chris and Heather and Kirsten just started us in the right direction. So I turn it back
Absolutely,
to
and
you,
that,
John.
and that's the time. Mona, please jump in here.
Well, I just have a question, which is, given what my understanding is of one of the basic principles of capitalism, which is maintaining worldwide openness to the movement of capital, to have an authoritarian, totalitarian power move on another country when we already have a part of the world where there's a huge totalitarian power, is a business risk as well as a social risk. So I guess that's a question. Is that not a significant consideration?
Yeah, no, and that's the whole idea behind the panel here, Mona, was to try to go deep into this particular aspect of warfare and understand from an ESG perspective what are those dimensions when it comes to the economic and the social aspects for Western companies, for the most part, operating in a capitalistic society. When you're faced with this kind of outcome, what's the right behavior? Is it just about your investors? Is it about your brand? Is it about humanity in a larger question? And then are you in a proactive stance or a defensive crouch? So we're trying to understand it from that kind of perspective. Are you just trying to protect yourself, make sure your investors don't run away, protect your brand, or are you standing up as a Western capital for the Western capitalistic system that says we don't like what's happening here?
And to relate it to yesterday, when I woke up in the morning and my wife, as I left her, said, "Say hello to that wonderful Daryl Banks. I'm so glad you brought him back." Can you believe Andrew said that when she woke up? She hardly knows you, Daryl. So we're glad you came by. I'm going to get you, rope you into this conversation. But the thing that I woke up to was a lot of the talks yesterday were about thriving in terrible times, right? So war is a more focused version of a terrible time, right? But if you think about what Edward was saying about opinion shifts on climate change, right? Americans are, and in the world, in Chris Coulter's case, they're trying to find ways to thrive in terrible times. In a sense, it's a different formula than just a business calculation, right? So I think these are new ways of thinking about the role of people and capitalism in terrible times. Anyway, that's just a thought.
No, it's going to be a big test. It's not just about did your logo show up on the list that Yale's producing, but what's your real long-term action here? So let me move us forward a little bit. What do you see here? Beyond the eyes, what do you see? What do you know about Vladimir Putin?
What's that, Harlan? Okay, so one element is spy, the stare of a spy. Okay, Dr. Mona, and if you don't want to get up to I'll restate the word so that there are people listening from other countries too, so that are part of it. So I'll repeat what you say.
Just that while his colleagues had pictures of Russian leaders on their office walls, he has a picture of Peter.
That's a good thing to note.
Okay, what about our great social historian here, Bruce? I'm going to put you on the spot here. What do you see?
I mean, no, it's not just about, well, let's put it this way. This is a sidebar that David makes me think of sportively. So I'm working for BP 6 weeks ago, and Bloomberg sends me to meet the mayor, Khan, and most of the reasons I'm there is BP. So I have time off on the days with the EVPs at BP, and I walk across St. James Plaza. And as I'm walking by, the first building I go by is called the Chatham House, right? Where the British set up the standards of civil discourse for the world, right? Set me up to stay at the place where British society created legal training in 1620, right? And I think I know something because I read Cardozo's The Judicial Process, but this society created Anglo stuff. But then, because of the fact that Tom Wolfe invited me to this club that I'm a member of, I can go into the club that's called the East Asia Club, where the British trained 1,000 imperial soldiers before they sent them off to kill people in India, before they sent them to kill people in Africa. So with the same 14 buildings, right? Now, when Ben Franklin spent 16 years in London, he stayed away from St. James. So there is a connection. He was viewed as a potential American spy, even though he was retained for lobbying purposes. He was trying to make peace most of those 16 years. But when you really read about Ben Franklin, David is saying something sportive. But Ben Franklin is also relevant, right? You have Chatham House rules, you have diplomacy, you have power in BP, you have imperial war in the East Asia thing. By the way, if you study the history of the East Asia Club that I stayed at, right? Not only did they kill thousands of people around the world for the sake of resources and for the sake of so-called open democracy, but they changed. 118 national structures of covenants became a commonwealth. So I think what we're talking about is that when you are a social history historian, you look at a guy like that and you say, what form of change will happen? How long will it take for society to change that type of tyrant, right? Who is structurally different than, say, Idi Amin was because of his cushion of power, right? He is more isolated from assassins or oligarchs or the normal way you take down a guy who looks like that. So if you look at social history, and I did this training at Oxford seminar, we studied the top 100 people that were assassinated because they looked like that guy. We don't know if that guy's going to be assassinated. We didn't know for 16 years if Ben Franklin was going to be assassinated. That's why he hung out by the stables of Piccadilly Circus, because he wanted to be able to escape by river when they were coming at him as a spy. So
I'm
it's
going to pull
interesting
on,
you thought
I'm going to
about
pull on
spies.
that thread, Bruce.
Yes.
Bill.
Hey, John, I may be misremembering history. Somebody can correct me, maybe you can. But don't I recall that in the early days of his first tenure, his first administration, George W. Bush met with Putin and he said something along the lines of, I looked into his eyes and I saw a man of God.
I find that hard to believe or to be accurate, Bill. What our country believes is that from a social perspective, those eyes are not the eyes of a great power politician. They're not the eyes of a great power politician. They're the eyes of they're the eyes of an identity entrepreneur.
Interesting. Please, Frank, you have things to say, but go to the microphone.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, wouldn't it be funny? That's not Putin. If it's Albert Schweitzer or Pope Francis.
It's Putin.
But I think let's pursue what John is saying from a war college perspective. So if you study war and you understand the sequence of diplomacy and international peace, and that capitalism in its very essence wants open commerce, that's a truth. That's a truth, I think, a truth since Thomas Jefferson said it, and since Thomas Jefferson's words are on the top of the Department of Commerce, right? If you study the history of openness of capitalism, I think it was Mona, you said that pretty much, right? Right, Mona? I mean, that's what capital is be able to invest as much in Australia as in San Francisco if you wanted to, right? But I think what John is getting us, and I know the slide sequence, so I'm going to shut up here. But what we're dealing with is a very difficult subject. It's easier to be indirect and witty about it than to look at those eyes straight away, right? I think that's one point to take away.
Yeah,
it
and
takes a certain type of person to look at those eyes eye to eye.
The real point in this slide is to drive home that this is not a short-term thing. The identity entrepreneur that Vladimir Putin is about recovering the Russian people from a psychic trauma of defeat from the Cold War.
Mona, that's what you were saying, right? By Peter the Great? Empire.
Right. So his objective is to restore Russia to some semblance of the former Soviet Union and to be among the great leaders of Russia, a la Peter the Great. The picture in his office, right? That's where he's going. So go back to that previous conflict slide I showed you. So where does he stop? If that's his objective, and that's what our country believes his objective is, where will he stop? Social historians will tell you that for a man like that, he won't accept accountability. Defeat will be blamed on others, and he'll lash out.
Let's talk about that. So you take the Oxford training, which is on the web, you can do it. And they do think that we need to think of him as a black bear in a corner. And only a fool knows to poke a black bear in a corner, right? So I think, John, you just said three things about him that we should talk about. Does anybody want to talk about this? It's easier to talk about people who are not so demonic as enemies, say Napoleon. So I'm going to say a few words about those who study Napoleon. So when you're in St. James Plaza, and I suggest you all go there when you're in London, it's only 20 minutes and it's 14 buildings. Next to the Imperial Club of East Asia Club is the hotel where the British elite came to celebrate the defeat of Napoleon, right? And I've read about those people who, the VIPs who were invited into that hotel, because they all were certain that Napoleon was a tyrant, that they all were certain that Napoleon was a key opponent. And they all knew that Napoleon was their enemy. So when they finally beat him in Waterloo, they had a list of 71 VIPs that was celebrating the defeat of Napoleon, right? Who are the 71 people who will celebrate the defeat of Putin is another way to think of this, right? Will it be the three leaders that are meeting today from the key nations? And in about 3 hours, the Romanian head will be the fourth. You can track these things in a transparent world. There are three non-American leaders meeting to discuss what we're discussing at this hour in Europe. Will they be some of the 71 that celebrate the planning to defeat this man? It's going to take a village of 70 leaders, not us. We don't really have this role. But history shows us that there will be someone, 70 of them, maybe 80 of them, that will get together and eliminate that look, right? We don't know who they are. But I found it very interesting that the Minister of Romania wants to be part of the big three that are meeting today. And
well, so the point of this is not to pull a fire alarm, right? We don't want everybody running to the fire exits. That's not what this is about. What this is about is helping us understand the dimension, the time dimension of ESG. The decisions these companies have made initially, which was pretty much a social reaction. Would you agree with that? You know, because the economics didn't make sense, right? Why are you going to take your profit and your revenue down? You know, so it was a response from a you know, almost a knee-jerk kind of response, if you'd accept that terminology, around social issues and just, you know, distrust and unlike of what was going on. But now we're in a situation where this could be very protracted. And we're gonna kind of unpack that with the other panel members as we move forward here. Go ahead, Paul.
Ira?
And next slide, please.
Ira has a comment. Please stand up, Ira.
Well, you did ask the question, where will Putin stop? And I'm not sure anybody gave you a direct answer to that. I will. I think that Putin has no respect for and does not fear Western Europe, nor does he respect or fear us in the United States at this time. He views us as a country in decline. The rest of the 21st century is going to be the Chinese century. And I'm pretty sure that Putin has not characterized China along with the rest of us. So it's going to be very interesting to see how Putin deals with China. I think by the demographics alone, it's going to be the Chinese century. And Putin's aggression in the Ukraine is just an unfortunate blip on the screen that prevents us from coming into alignment with Russia in the coming years in order to counterbalance China.
There's a lot of dimensions to that. Thanks for sharing that, Ira. I think the other piece of this that probably ought to be mentioned here, and I'll tell you this from a former military perspective, is we know our defense establishment knows, not believes, not thinks, knows that the military doctrine of Russia is such that they don't draw a distinction between conventional and chemical and biological warfare. Chemical and biological weapons to Russians are just another weapon. The aspect of the humanity of indiscriminate killing, you see evidence of that today, and we have for the last over 90 days. They don't care. They will do, the Russian military doctrine will use whatever means necessary to achieve their outcome. So there's a tripwire here, right? There's a tripwire. So this question is okay, let's say for whatever reason, the 71 come together and there's some sort of armistice or truce or ceasefire, but somehow or another, a miracle happens and people stop shooting. And it's a North-South Korea kind of outcome. Drawing it back to the corporate world and capitalism, if that is a potential outcome, then what do you do as a company? What are you going to do? Stay out of Russia? Pull back? What are you going to do?
Does anybody want to comment on the idea that the world is a hostile place and that throughout social history, borders of tension are drawn to deal with differences of nation states, but that commerce flows relative to those borders, so that the borders are established for political reasons, that some commerce continues. And the easiest way to think of it is that it's very hard to trade in North Korea. It's almost impossible for the ordinary capitalist to make money in North Korea. But what John is asking is maybe that's optionality one, where if there is a ceasefire, there's going to be borders of tension. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah. It'll essentially be a North Korea, South Korea deal. But the point to the companies and to your students or whatever the walk of life is you got to have some options, and you need to be thinking long term because this isn't going to go away.
And I guess I would add my words in that it's not terrible. It's a way of thriving, even though it's an imperfect existential circumstance, to be able to trade with South Korea and not trade with North Korea. You know what I mean, Mona? The world is not a perfect place to thrive, right? So that I think option A is not a happy option. But it's an existential one.
The other point I want to draw out here, and this is where hopefully people can comment, is if you're in this for the long haul, that's an option perhaps, and this is a long haul, and your ESG response is trendy. It's not based on values, beliefs, core mission statement. It's not integrated into the fabric of your organization. How long will it last? At what point will the financial pressure cause you to change? Or are you rock solid in your beliefs and values that you will stay the fight? How deep do the ESG principles in your organization go? And that's the point of this panel, why we want to bring some of this material up. We're going to talk about energy and a few other things in a minute. But to really go deep, where are you as CSOs, CEOs, others in your ESG journey with respect to the governance of your company or your organization? Is it fundamental to the company?
Kirsten, can I ask you to say even more? So one of the many things I learned so far is when Kirsten said that United Health is not active in Russia, but their key partners, Accenture and Microsoft, developed a two optionality response. One, they're helping the people that they employ in Russia get ready to change. And she also said that there was a financial translation of that in stipends. Do you want to tell us more about that? This is a company, United Health, that's a new member. We want to, so please do a Google search on the 100 million that United Health gave in the last 10 days to create a diversity and inclusion campaign. So if you could also tell us about the number of scholarships and why you're a social response capitalist organization, that it's not just pure capitalism when you decide to give 100 million. It's just a way of breaking the tension of the war college stuff for a minute. But I think it would be good for you to tell why you just, what's the 100 million for, and how do you actually help, or do you at all? Would you just watch Microsoft and Accenture? Do you mind?
Sure. I don't really have a lot more to add on what Accenture and Microsoft are doing in Ukraine. We just, they're close partners of ours, particularly around COVID responses around the world. And in India, we all have significant, and Walmart, we have significant workforces in India and the Philippines, and we worked quite closely on supporting our employees there. The 100 million is a grant over 10 years from the United Health Foundation, and it is to build a diverse healthcare workforce of the future. It's not just building skills for, we certainly hope some of those students who get scholarships join us, but it is just to build a stronger, diverse network of clinicians in the United States, so we can have cultural competency and getting people the care they need. And often a barrier is they want a caregiver that looks like them or understands them and understands the different medical landscapes of different types of people. So the scholarships are for 4-year degrees, and it's also for people who already have certifications and degrees who might want to extend their license.
Thank you. So point A, you cannot imagine that type of generosity happening in Russia, North Korea, right? I've studied some of the failed states. There are 22 of them. You can't imagine that type of social response, right? So capitalism no longer just responds for profit maximization. It responds for changing social needs and demographics, right? So what I think I heard Kirsten say is that they're enhancing and accelerating diversity and inclusion of the next generation. Is that what you heard, Ed? Do you want to comment a little bit? Because getting back to Putin, the best way to punish Putin, I think, is for the world to realize not only that he's an autocrat and not only that he has oligarchs, but that he's socially backwards and that he made his people socially backward. What do you think of that, Dal? Does that make sense? And that comes in the modern world at a cost. It's the beginning of a failed state. If you measure the United Nations definitions of the 21 failed states, like Somalia, right? He's getting close to some of that. What do you think, Alistair? Does that make sense? Anyway, John.
Well, so the dynamics of the economic side, we want to put this up here just because this is pretty reflective of a very different environment, right? If you follow the markets, this is not what you normally see from, returns, right, and growth. Some of it's pretty obvious. A lot of it's a surprise. So you see the dichotomy of arming up for a war, but at the same time addressing energy.